Camp Concordia, Kansas. November 1943. The mess hall stretched long and low beneath a sky so vast it made the earth feel small, its windows glowing yellow against the gathering dusk. 18-year-old Klaus Schneider stood at the entrance, hollow-cheeked and trembling, staring at more food than he had seen in 2 years. Steam rose from industrial kettles. The scent of beef stew and fresh bread filled the air. American guards ate shoulder to shoulder with their charges at wooden tables. Klaus had been taught that Americans were wasteful, careless, weak. What happened in the next hour would shatter that belief through the simple, devastating power of a meal served without hatred. And in that moment, watching abundance he couldn't comprehend, he realized Germany had already lost the war. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this journey into history, please like and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. Your support helps us share powerful moments and keep these stories alive that changed lives forever worldwide. Klaus had surrendered in Tunisia 6 months earlier, emerging from a collapsed bunker with his hands raised and his body already starving. The Afrika Korps had been decimated. In May 1943, over 267,000 German and Italian troops surrendered in North Africa, the largest Axis capitulation of the war. Klaus was one of them. He was 18 but looked younger, sharp cheekbones pressing against skin that had forgotten fullness, eyes too large, and a face carved down by months of inadequate rations. The desert had taken everything from him except the will to survive. The British processed him first at a temporary camp near Tunis. Dust settled over everything. Men waited in long lines for water that tasted of chemicals and hope. Then came the ships converted cargo vessels crossing the Atlantic in convoy while submarines prowled beneath. Klaus spent most of that crossing in the hold, pressed shoulder to shoulder with other prisoners, breathing air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and sickness. The engines throbbed. The hull creaked. He wondered if drowning would be quick or slow. They fed them on the ships. Hard biscuits, canned soup that tasted of salt and tin, produced in some American factory Klaus couldn't imagine. It was more than he had eaten in Tunisia, but not enough to stop the gnawing emptiness that had become his constant companion. He learned to eat slowly, to make each mouthful last, to ignore the cramping when food arrived after too long without. In his pack, wrapped in oilcloth against the Atlantic spray, Klaus carried 3 photographs and a letter. The photographs showed his mother and 2 younger sisters, taken before the regime had called up every able-bodied man. The letter from his mother had arrived in Tunisia just before the final collapse. She wrote of rationing growing more severe, of air raids that sent them to the cellar, of neighbors whose sons had not returned from the Eastern Front. She wrote that she prayed for him every night. Klaus had stopped believing in God somewhere between Hamburg and North Africa, but he kept the letter anyway. America revealed itself gradually, first a smudge on the horizon, then a coastline of impossible green, finally a harbor crowded with ships, cranes, and organized chaos. They disembarked at Norfolk, Virginia, where November felt warm compared to Germany. American soldiers processed them with efficient indifference, checking documents, assigning numbers, loading them onto trains bound for inland camps. The train journey lasted 3 days. Klaus watched forests stretch endlessly, farmland flatten the sky, towns untouched by war. In Germany, cities lay in rubble and women queued for bread. Here, shop windows overflowed with abundance that seemed obscene. He didn't know the numbers, but the view told a story more painful than hunger. The prisoners whispered rumors. Some spoke of brutal camps, others of fairness. Klaus said little. Survival meant keeping expectations low. Kansas arrived as flatness turned philosophy, land unbroken in all directions, sky vast enough to drown in. Camp Concordia appeared at sunset, golden light washing over farmland, turned prison, clean, new, and strangely temporary. Rows of wooden barracks sat behind wire and towers. Processing followed, more documents, more rules. Klaus claimed a middle bunk in Barracks 7, Block C, placing his pack with quiet precision. Around him, men secured tiny territories, moving carefully, accustomed to having individuality erased. The barracks were heated. Klaus noticed slowly, warmth competing with exhaustion. Radiators pumped thick air, a luxury after freezing desert nights and ship holds. It was small, almost negligible, yet felt like the first genuine kindness he'd known in months. At night they were fed, white bread and hot soup, ladled by American soldiers into tin cups. Klaus ate slowly, wary of his shrunken stomach. No one fought for food. No one hoarded. There was enough. That fact unsettled him more than fences or rifles ever could. He lay awake, listening to 50 men breathe, heat humming through the room. America was supposed to be weak, decadent. Yet here was abundance, heated camps, white bread, kindness without ceremony. Hunger was physical. This was worse, the realization that everything he'd been taught might be a lie. Morning came early. A bell announced breakfast shifts. Otto told Klaus the truth hit hardest there, not militarily, but economically. How far ahead America was. Guards watched calmly, even kindly, as prisoners crossed the compound. Smoke rose from the mess hall. The smell of bacon stopped Klaus cold. Inside, abundance overwhelmed him, scrambled eggs piled high, endless bacon, buttered, toast, potatoes, fruit, coffee, milk. An American soldier spoke German, smiled, told him to take seconds. Klaus sat trembling before real food. He tasted eggs and bacon, crunching, rich, undeniable. His body remembered what living felt like. Around Klaus, prisoners ate with varying control. Some forced themselves to slow down. Others ate desperately, as if the food might vanish. A few new arrivals became sick, unable to process abundance after deprivation. Klaus stopped halfway through his plate, breathing carefully, fighting nausea. Leaving food would once have been unthinkable. Here, many did. Becker moved through the hall, refilling coffee cups. Seeing Klaus's plate, he spoke gently in German, explaining that adjustment took time and suggesting milk as easier nourishment. Klaus sipped the cold, creamy liquid, nothing like rationed milk from Hamburg. Otto explained how bodies recovered, weight returned, faces filled out, men looked human again. They do this everywhere? Klaus asked. Otto nodded. Geneva Convention rules. Americans followed them seriously. Prisoners ate what American soldiers ate. This wasn't kindness, it was normal. They had so much food that feeding enemies barely registered. The realization settled heavily. Germany had conquered Europe, yet starved its people. America fought globally and fed everyone. The propaganda hadn't been exaggerated, it had been catastrophically false. Klaus stared down at his plate, at food that represented more calories than he had consumed across entire days, during the retreat through Tunisia. He thought of his mother's letters, carefully worded and increasingly vague, of ration cards that bought less each month, of the quiet certainty that the war could not end the way he had been promised. The eggs cooled untouched. His appetite faded, not from sickness, but from understanding. 3 weeks later, that understanding sharpened into something heavier. Klaus received a letter forwarded through the Red Cross, its envelope creased and worn by distance and delay. His mother was alive. His sisters were safe, sent to the countryside where food was still possible to find. Hamburg had been bombed again. The apartment building was gone. She lived in a shelter now, surrounded by strangers, praying daily that her son still breathed. Klaus read the letter slowly, then again, absorbing not only what remained, but what the censors had removed. He folded the paper with care and placed it against his chest, as though proximity to his heart might protect it. Around him, prisoners ate breakfast in low murmurs, steam rising from plates. Klaus left his food unfinished and walked outside, pulled by a need for space he could not explain. The Kansas sky stretched endlessly above the fence, an ocean of blue with nowhere to hide. Klaus stood there, hands in his coat pockets, feeling the bitter irony settle in his bones. He was safe. He was fed. He slept in a heated barracks and woke to regular meals. Meanwhile, his mother lived among ruins, surviving on rations that shrank even as her sacrifices grew. Germany had promised victory through suffering. Instead, Germany was collapsing, while its enemy fed prisoners better than it fed its own people. Otto joined him without speaking at first, respecting the silence. When he did speak, it was about guilt, the strange burden of being one of the fortunate ones. Otto told him about an American sergeant who had once asked, genuinely confused, why a government would allow its civilians to starve while waging war. The question had stunned Otto. Loyalty, he explained, worked differently here. It wasn't enforced through fear or punishment. It was earned through obligation returned. Klaus turned the thought over slowly. In Germany, loyalty had been demanded absolutely. Doubt was treason. Questions were dangerous. Here, American soldiers followed orders not because terror demanded it, but because they believed in something reciprocal, that a nation owed its people the same devotion it asked of them. The idea unsettled Klaus more deeply than hunger ever had. "What happens when this ends?" Klaus asked quietly. Otto imagined rebuilding, telling the truth about what they had seen, that the enemy they were taught to hate had treated them with fairness and abundance. Klaus doubted anyone would believe them at first. Propaganda did not vanish with surrender. But perhaps, over time, truth would surface if enough men survived to carry it home. Klaus looked back toward the mess hall, smoke rising into the vast sky. Survival itself, he realized, had become a form of resistance against lies, against fear, against the ideology that had sent him to war. And for the first time, he understood that coming home would not mean returning unchanged. December brought snow and cutting wind. The Americans announced a Christmas celebration. Prisoners decorated the mess hall with paper stars and evergreen branches. On Christmas Eve, lights glowed, food overflowed, and gifts waited. The commander spoke of shared humanity. Klaus felt tears burn proof that even enemies could choose decency. They ate. Conversation flowed in multiple languages, German, English. A few prisoners who spoke French or Italian adding their voices to the mix. American guards sat at the tables among the prisoners, eating the same food, laughing at jokes that crossed linguistic barriers through tone and gesture. Someone started singing Silent Night in German, Still Not, and the whole mess hall joined in. The carol, written by an Austrian priest long before nationalism had tried to turn neighbors into enemies. When they reached the verse about sleep and heavenly peace, Klaus's voice broke. He thought about his mother in her shelter, his sisters with their aunt, all the families torn apart by a war that had promised glory but delivered only suffering. After dinner, prisoners opened their packages. Inside were small gifts, chocolate bars, cigarettes for those who smoked, writing paper and pencils, small toiletry items. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just tokens that acknowledged their humanity. Klaus's package included chocolate American, chocolate that tasted different from German chocolate, but was sweet and rich and somehow perfect, along with paper for letters and a small wooden pencil carved with the words Camp Concordia, Kansas, 1943. He held the pencil in his hand, studying it. This small object, given freely by the enemy, would allow him to write to his mother, to tell her he was alive and safe and well treated. The regime had promised that capture meant torture or death. Instead, he had found heated barracks and abundant food, and Americans who gave him pencils for Christmas so he could communicate with the family he had been torn away from. The evening ended with music. An American soldier played guitar, while a German prisoner, who had been a music teacher in Munich, played harmonica. They performed Christmas carols in both languages, O Tannenbaum and Joy to the World. We wish you a Merry Christmas, blending together into something that belonged to no single nation, but to all people who had ever known winter and hoped for spring. Klaus walked back to his barracks that night, full of turkey and pie, his pockets carrying chocolate and his hand gripping the pencil. And he understood with complete clarity that the war was already over, even if the fighting hadn't stopped. Germany had lost, not just militarily, but morally, ideologically, spiritually. A nation that starved its people while fighting couldn't compete with a nation that fed its enemies at Christmas. A regime built on hatred and lies couldn't withstand the corrosive power of simple, persistent kindness. He wrote to his mother that night, using his new pencil and paper by the light of the barracks lamps. He told her he was safe. He told her he was being treated well. He told her, in careful words that might pass the censors, that the Americans were not what they had been told, that abundance was real here, that there was hope for something better once the fighting finally ended. He told her he loved her and his sisters, and that he would survive to see them again. He sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning mail collection. Then he lay in his bunk, listening to the breathing of 50 other prisoners, feeling the warmth from the radiators, his stomach full for maybe the first time in 3 years. And he let himself cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being alive and the devastating recognition that everything he had believed had been wrong, and that being wrong had somehow saved his life. Klaus would remain at Camp Concordia until May 1946, long after the fighting in Europe had ended, long after the regime had collapsed into rubble and revelation. He would gain 40 pounds, would learn English fluently, would work in the wood shop and teach carpentry to other prisoners who wanted skills for the uncertain future. He would write letters to his mother regularly, and she would write back with news of Hamburg's reconstruction, of his sisters growing up in the aftermath of devastation, of life slowly returning to a city that had been reduced to ruins. When he finally returned to Germany in 1946, he brought with him the wooden pencil from that Christmas dinner, the photographs he had carried through Tunisia and across the Atlantic, and a letter of recommendation from Sergeant Walsh. That described his work ethic and character in terms that would help him find employment in a nation desperate for skilled craftsmen to rebuild. He would tell his story often to family, to friends, to children and grandchildren in years that stretched far beyond the war that had defined his youth. He would describe the moment he walked into that Kansas mess hall and saw more food than he had imagined still existed in the world. He would explain how abundance had defeated propaganda more effectively than any weapon, how kindness had destroyed ideology through the simple power of treating enemies as human beings worthy of dignity and care. They fed us, he would say years later, when the war had become history and personal memory had transformed into collective story. Not just to keep us alive, they could have done that with minimal rations. They fed us the same food their own soldiers ate. They heated our barracks. They gave us Christmas dinner with turkey and pie. They taught us English and treated us fairly, and never once made us feel less than human. And in doing that, they destroyed everything the regime had taught us, not through cruelty or revenge, but through the devastating power of mercy that refuses to see enemies only people. The wooden pencil stayed with him until his death in 1987, kept in a drawer with other treasures from a life well-lived, photographs of his wife and children, letters from his mother, his American citizenship papers from 1952 when he had immigrated permanently. The pencil had been used to write thousands of words, but its most important message had been the one it carried simply by existing, that even in war, even between enemies, humanity could persist if people chose to preserve it. In the end, that single breakfast in November 1943 had done more to defeat the regime and Klaus Schneider's heart than any battle or bomb. The meal had changed his life, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented: a nation so abundant it could afford generosity, even toward its enemies. A people who believed that dignity and mercy weren't weaknesses but strengths, and a future where former foes might learn to build something better together than they had ever built in opposition.